Is racism still a problem in America today? Now, this might sound like a simple question with a simple answer, but it's also a somewhat controversial one depending on who you ask. In this video, I'll seek to answer this question definitively by summarizing data from an article recently published in Business Insider. But before I do, I want to take a step back and remind you of exactly what we mean in psychology by racism. In a previous video, we differentiated between stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination. In our videos so far, we've been focusing mostly on stereotypes and prejudice, with the exception of colorism, which is a form of discrimination. Now, however, we'll be focusing on discrimination because racism is a form of discrimination. Racism involves behavior, it involves an act of some kind in an institution, so it's discrimination. Okay, one last sort of distinction to make before we jump into the data. Racist versus racism. Now, I hear these terms being used sort of indiscriminately from one another, and in fact, they are different. A racist behavior is a behavior that discriminates against a person based on their race or ethnicity, racial group membership. So a racist behavior is like one individual acting racist toward another individual. Racism is something a little bit different. When discrimination in this way becomes institutionalized in the policies and practices of an organization, then it's racism. So it's sort of a broader thing, a more global thing, an institutionalized thing, rather than a racist behavior of one individual to another. For example, a grocery store cashier who treats Hispanic customers but not other customers more rudely is racist. But we'd also call it racism if that grocery store in general had some policies or practices or cultures that encourage these sorts of behaviors among its employees store-wide. So that racism in that case would be systemic. So we would call it racism. Okay, so let's discuss a few examples of racism, again, institutionalized in our culture, in our society, in America. So what follows will be a heavily data-driven discussion, but please bear with me because I believe these findings are important and they're worth trying to understand. I'll do my best to interpret everything for you, so just listen to my voice, and if you need to pause the video to look at some of the graphs at the same time, that's totally fine. Okay, so what you're seeing here is that unemployment rates spiked for all racial and ethnic groups, and this is just two examples, white and black people, but everybody had unemployment rate increases with the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. But what you might notice is that this disproportionately affected black Americans compared to, for example, white ones. So the unemployment rate jumped much higher for black Americans. Black Americans are also underrepresented in high-paying jobs, for example, in management, professional, and related occupations. A tangential but relevant enough study from Harvard University showed that when Black and Asian Americans whitened their resumes, for example, by using white-sounding names or American-sounding names, or by otherwise removing ethnic details from their resumes, they were much more likely to receive callbacks for corporate interviews. And this, unfortunately, seems to make quite a big difference. For example, just thinking about black applicants, 25% of black candidates who whitened their resumes received interview callbacks versus only 10% of black candidates who didn't. Similarly, at the very upper echelon, the top of the corporate hierarchy, people of color, and in particular black Americans, are heavily underrepresented. So what you're seeing in this graph here is the number of Fortune 500 and S&P 500 companies, so top-of-the-line companies, biggest companies, with CEOs of various racial and ethnic groups. And black Americans are a small minority percentage. As of 2020, for example, only 4 Fortune 500 companies had black CEOs. There was pharmaceutical company Merck & Co., home improvement retailer Lowe's, fashion holding company Tapestry, and the insurance company TIAA. That's it. In the workforce broadly, black workers have historically earned far less than white workers. For example, the U.S. Census Bureau reported that in 2018, the average black worker earned just 62% of what the average white worker made. And the wage gap between races also interacts with the gender wage gap between men and women. That is, this is an intersectionality effect, which we'll discuss in much more detail in our next video. In 2018, for example, the typical black woman earned just 66% of what the typical white man made. And one way to illustrate these sorts of gaps is through looking at what we call equal pay days for different groups. So an equal pay day for a particular group or gender marks sort of the extra days that someone in a group would need to work into the following year to earn what the typical white man earned in the previous year. So based on income figures from 2018, for example, it would take the median black woman worker 226 extra days into the next year to earn what the median white male worker, white man, made in the previous year. And you can see that this is even worse for Hispanic women. A Hispanic woman has to work an extra 307 days to earn what the typical white man earned in the previous year. So almost earning half as much, taking twice as long to make the same amount. This is a problem. And what about education? Here you're looking at the percentage of people 25 or older who have completed college. You'll see that these percentages have increased over time for everybody, in this case for white and black Americans, but the percentage of black Americans has been consistently low over time, and this has not changed. There's still an education gap there. And what about homeownership? Lower income rates and higher rates of poverty and lower education combined with difficulties in getting mortgage approval for black Americans mean that home ownership rates for black Americans have remained lower than other racial ethnic groups in America. Okay, so we've talked about income, education, home ownership, things like that. What about health? In 2018, black Americans were nearly twice as likely as their white neighbors to lack health insurance. This is a problem as well. And finally, we'll talk just a little bit about criminal justice. In 2018, black people made up about 33% of America's prison population, despite the fact that they make up only 12% of the country's overall population. So you have a small percentage of the population, but a large percentage in prisons. White people, however, showed the opposite trend. Despite being the majority group in America, they made up about 60% of the country's overall population, there were fewer white inmates than black ones in America's prisons. Okay, so here's another intersectionality effect involving not only race, but also gender and age. Black men are more likely than any other group to be imprisoned. For every 100,000 black men, for example, there are 2,272 inmates. However, for white people, for every 100,000 white people, there are only 392 inmates. And the bias is worse for black men ages 18 and 19, so we're incorporating age as well. Black men ages 18 and 19 are nearly 13 times as likely as white men of the same age, also 18 and 19, to be incarcerated. Last, what you're seeing here is the data for fatal shootings per million based on race. And per million here means that we're factoring out the population differences between black and white Americans. White Americans are shot by police more, but there are also many more white Americans than black ones. So we have to kind of account for that population difference. This is data for between 2015 and 2020. So black Americans are fatally shot by police at a disproportionate rate compared to their representation in U.S. population. So coming back to our original question, is racism a problem in America still? Looking at the data, and there's much more that we could look at, I would answer unequivocally yes.